Okay, we are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome today. I hope you all have been enjoying this conference as much as I have. Today, we are going to be talking about leading with empathy, how women in learning and development shape inclusive learning cultures with Sarah Syed. So, I am Jaleesa Brown. I am your moderator today, and I'm extremely happy to be here. So Sarah Syed is currently a lead education design consultant at Allstate and has been working in learning and development for the last 7 years. She has a unique background as she started her career in higher education, teaching and designing curriculum in philosophy, sociology, and career readiness. She worked as a human resources and training consultant while teaching before fully transitioning over to corporate learning and development in 2021. The heart of her work is leading the creation of impactful and inclusive learning experiences and advocating for learner-centered design. So welcome, Sarah. We are so excited to hear what you have to say. I'm going to go ahead and go off to the background and give you the floor.
Sure. Thanks for the introduction, Jaleesa. My name is Sarah. I am joining from the Chicagoland area. We have some stormy weather here today, so hopefully you don't lose power or anything like that. Um, my pronouns are she and her. I am a woman with blondish brown hair, hazel eyes. I'm wearing glasses and a black top. As Jaleesa mentioned, I am a former educator, teaching and writing courses in philosophy, social sciences, and career readiness. So a lot of what you're going to hear today, if you're not necessarily in the corporate L&D space, but you're in maybe like the academic L&D space or transitioning from teaching, a lot of what we talk about today is transferable and really draws on foundational education theories in education. So we know that inclusive learning cultures are built on the principles of psychological safety, right? We just had an amazing session earlier today about this innovation and engagement, and overall just a learner-centered design. And we know that empathy is a key driver of these principles, and that at the foundational level, right? When we look at foundational theories of learning, which we'll do today, that empathy enables us to improve our learning cultures across our organizations or the learning spaces that we are in. As organizations and learning spaces adapt to the needs of diverse workforces, inclusive learning environments, and cultivating inclusive learning environments, they are not only a compliance necessity or a moral imperative, as how I like to think of it, but also a strategic approach to drive innovation, engagement, and overall performance across your organization. So what we're going to talk about today is how women in particular in L&D are uniquely positioned to lead the charge in cultivating and creating inclusive learning cultures using our strengths in relationship building, active listening, all of the work that everyone in this conference and so many others outside of TLDC are leading the charge in learner-centered design. And so integrating the principles of empathy into our L&D practices is really key in driving organizational change. And that's what we're going to get into today. So without further ado, I'll transition over to our agenda. So really what I want to do today is take you on a journey through the intersection of leading with empathy and inclusive learning cultures. We'll discuss how the integration of key foundational education theory, right, constructivism, pragmatism, and humanism. And if you're not familiar, we'll go through what all of those theories say and mean, but how those foundational theories enable psychological safety, cultural relevance, and accessibility in L&D programs, which are all essential for learning experiences to be inclusive. We'll share I'll share some practical strategies for leaning and leveraging empathy to cultivate these inclusive learning cultures. And we'll talk about the social science, the psychology, and the philosophy behind these principles so that you can use that theory, that underpinning, to leverage when you're advocating for inclusive learning spaces in your organizations. And in the spirit of collaborative learning and open spaces for discussion, I'll call on you to sort of share and chat your strategies along the way so that we can all benefit from the immense amount of wisdom, not only in this room, but, throughout the conference. I had mentioned to Jaleesa earlier that I had sort of a checklist of like, hey, here's a good resource, here's a good resource. And I was like, you know what? This whole conference is an amazing resource. So I'm really encouraging you to connect with other presenters and with your network to lean on that as well. Then we'll close out by looking at some real world case studies that highlight the tangible benefits of inclusive learning cultures, because it's those stories, it's those business imperatives that you really need to move this work forward within an organization. And so really my goal for the session is that you come away with tools that you'll need to advocate not only for inclusive learning culture, but for yourself as a key change maker in the industry and within your organization. So with that, we will dive right into what is empathy, right? We all kind of like have these ideas of what empathy is. We understand it. We know what it means. But I think it's important because we're going to get into the foundational aspects of empathy that we sort of level set. So empathy, leading with empathy, right, involves understanding and sharing the feelings of others, leading to stronger interpersonal relationships and effective team dynamics when you're in a shared space. It enhances self-awareness, listening skills, and mentoring capabilities that contribute to positive organizational culture. So this is what we know to be true. But how about empathy's impact on what I consider and what the data shows are key drivers for creating inclusive organizational cultures? So these principles of innovation, engagement, and retention. Empathy's always been a critical skill for leaders, but as I mentioned in the introduction, even more so in today's evolving environment, right? Organizations are navigating unpredictable market conditions, shifting job stability. I think we every day we go on LinkedIn, at least for me, I see posts around layoffs and people that have sort of had a change in their career that was sort of forced upon them. And so empathy plays an even more vital role in our environment today in ensuring that employees feel valued and that they feel safe, right? So in 2021, Forbes did a study on these three indicators of sort of people feeling like they were in an inclusive organizational culture. And 50% of people with empathetic leaders reported that their workplace was inclusive, compared to only 17% of employees with less, or what they described as less empathetic leaders. Around 61% of employees felt more capable of innovation under leaders that exuded empathy, compared to only 13% with leaders that they felt were less empathetic. Around 76% of employees who experienced empathy from their leaders reported being engaged and more highly engaged in their work, compared to only 32% with less empathetic leaders. And around 60% of women stated that they were unlikely to leave their companies when they felt respected and valued, and they had a sense of psychological safety, compared to only 22% who expressed reluctance to leave with less empathetic leaders. So we know, and the data tells us, that empathy is directly tied to psychological safety and retention. But are we surprised by this data? I think on the surface, no, right? We can think about our own experiences and where we are within our organizations and how we feel relative to our leadership and maybe our place within our own organization. So we know that we're happier and we're more innovative and we're more engaged. But I think when we see the numbers and we see the data, it tells a bigger story. And that's what we're going to work on and work through today, is how do we translate the data within our own learning programs to tell these types of stories so that the business understands the imperative of putting resources and money and time towards inclusive learning programs to show that they do show the impact that they do have on an overall organization. So all this tells us that empathy is key, right? Empathy is a superpower. It's closely tied to increased employee engagement. It's closely tied to increased psychological safety and innovation, which we know are all key drivers of performance. So genuinely understanding and addressing concerns, empathetic leaders and those that lead with empathy cultivate a culture of trust and open communication, which enhances their commitment, right? Have you ever worked on a project that you just were not committed to, right? Versus something that you were committed to, when you do see yourself in the work that you're doing, that increases performance. And so, as we know, empathy plays a crucial role in creating psychological safety, a work environment where individuals feel safe to take risks, express their thoughts without fear or negative consequences. Those environments encourage open dialogue. Those environments encourage learning from mistakes and collaborative problem solving, which are all essential for high-performing teams. So when empathy is felt, people are more inclined to engage in innovative behaviors, and it enables the understanding of diverse perspectives, which help to foster an inclusive atmosphere where creativity can flourish. And that's what we want in learning, right? That's what we want in our L&D programs. So how does empathy impact L&D? How does leading with empathy impact the L&D space? Well, it's no different, right? In fact, we see the same key indicators at play as we do in an overall organization. We see the same key indicators when we go a level down and we look at L&D programming specifically, right? Engagement, psychological safety, and innovation. Empathy in L&D is rooted in understanding and responding to needs, right? Feelings and perspectives of all learners, right? We talk about, we think of our like design approaches and how they're iterative and how we take feedback and we build upon them. That is empathy in L&D in one form, right? Through instructional design. But we know that when our programming is effective, we see an increase in engagement, in retention, in performance, in innovation. And we also gain buy-in from learners, right? We have people that want to participate in our L&D programs. We have people that want to take ownership over their learning and engage with it. And that positively impacts overall organizational success. So all that to say that L&D teams play a vital role in shaping the workplace culture through these inclusive learning environments and ensuring that our learning environments and those learning experiences are inclusive. So Inclusive learning cultures enable better engagement, right? They enable retention in our programs and they enable innovation. The research consistently supports the idea that inclusivity in L&D programs leads to higher employee performance and greater organizational success, right? When learning programs are developed with empathy at the foundational level, so drawing on these very foundational theories in education and using that as sort of the roadmap for the programs that we put out and the initiatives that we put out, learning becomes more aligned with real world challenges, which is what we have to do. If the learning isn't relevant and it's not aligned to what our attendees or our learners are doing out in the real world, it's not going to be effective. So as we examine this through the lens of these educational theories, we find that empathy is essential for creating psychologically safe spaces in education that allow for risk-taking innovation and learning that is truly authentic. Because when learning is authentic, that's when we see the lift in engagement. If it feels canned, if it feels too off the shelf, if it feels too out of touch, we're not going to get the engagement that we want. And so empathetic leadership in this context truly involves leaders who listen actively. And when I say leaders, I mean leaders in advocating and cultivating inclusive learning. So wherever you sit within your organization and space, actively listening, understanding the individual needs of learners, and adapting our learning experiences accordingly, making changes when needed to ensure that we're doing that. And women and L&D explicitly have been recognized for our ability to cultivate empathetic and inclusive learning environments. Our unique perspectives and our unique experiences contribute to approaches that prioritize listening, prioritize mutual respect and collaboration, which enhances inclusivity within our organization. So regardless of our positions within the hierarchy, our responsibility now shifts not only from cultivating these environments and ensuring our learning environments are inclusive, but making sure that the business understands that this is a crucial to the overall success and health of the business. So that's where we're going to go to next, is how do we do that? How do we bridge that gap? And what tools can we use to do that? So looking at this from I like to say a philosophical level background, my graduate degree is in philosophy. So, over the span of the last 7 years, as I've been working in L&D and coming from a teaching background, you see all the connections between basic, accessible design processes and practices and how those are rooted in these very philosophical theories on education. So humanist education theories highlight the importance of personal growth and self-actualization. And we know that psychologically safe learning environments nurture learners' potential and encourage both personal and professional development. And that's essential for creating an environment where learners can take risks, where they can share their thoughts, where they can make mistakes without fear. When you think of humanism at its basic philosophical, as a basic philosophical theory, it literally means that human beings have the right and responsibility to give meaning to and to shape their own lives. So that's what we should be doing through our education environment and our learning environment. So how do we nurture that? How do we ensure that we are, encouraging personal and professional development in our education strategies, right? We make sure it's psychologically safe. And we do that by creating spaces for open dialogue where individuals feel comfortable asking questions, voicing concerns, and sharing their perspectives. So when I was teaching, I used to do Socratic seminars, which those are totally relevant in the corporate L&D space. Providing opportunities where session attendees can discuss, they drive the discussion, right? And they're encouraged to engage with those around them. When you think of maybe like e-learning or on-demand learning, incorporating reflective dialogues, right? I've given you all this information about this process that you now have to adhere to. How do you feel about that? What do you think about that? How might you incorporate that? Providing those opportunities to reflect, and discussion boards are great as well because they provide that open space where you can share your ideas and thoughts. For, I think about like e-learnings again. How do we implement low stakes learning activities? Branched scenarios, right, where learners can make decisions, where they can experience failure in a safe environment. And outside of that, use the chat. What strategies do you all implement or would like to implement that you feel cultivate a psychologically safe environment that really leans on this idea of humanism, an idea of creating an environment where people feel safe to contribute? I'll give you guys a minute to think about it and share in the chat so we can all learn from each other. This list is obviously not exhaustive, but I'd love to learn more from everyone. Give it another few seconds. And if you like, think about this. Think about, as we're going through this, think about strategies that you implement. I see using real world materials to give learners the opportunity to relate the materials to their lives. Absolutely. We're actually going to get into that a little bit later with some examples. So what about innovation, right? How do we create learning environments that enable innovation? So when we look at pragmatism, right? Anybody heard of John Dewey and his theory in pragmatism? It emphasizes the importance of learning through experience, right? And adapting our educational practices to meet the individual needs of everyone. And pragmatism supports the development of learning environments that are flexible, because when we're too rigid, we can become inaccessible. Our learning environments need to be learner-centered and responsive to the unique needs of each learner. When we think about pragmatism at its basic philosophical level, it emphasizes that the practical consequences of ideas, so the practical results of our ideas, are the basis for truth and meaning. In plain language, right? This means that language, so how we communicate, thought, how we think, and the ideas that we put forth, they don't merely represent reality. They are tools for action and problem solving that shape our reality, right? So adaptability and problem solving are the foundation of knowledge, and creativity emerges when we provide spaces for reflection and for exploration. And that's where innovation comes in. Those are key drivers for innovation. So how do we get there from a strategic perspective, right? Learning should be adaptive to individual needs. This is what pragmatism tells us. So accessibility in learning materials is vital to ensuring that all learners can engage meaningfully and at all, right? If our learning materials are not accessible to everyone, then what are we doing? right? Provide closed captioning where needed, transcripts, alt text, screen reader friendly materials, right? But don't stop there. In fact, there were some speakers on these topics today. So there's tons of resources out there to ensure that you have the tools to be able to put this into action. But don't stop at closed captions. Don't stop at that. Offer flexible learning pathways, right? Self-paced modules, micro learning, or when a 30-minute e-learning session may just be too much for a lot of people, too much information in one space. Blended learning formats and alternate ways to engage with content, right? There's only one way to engage. We go up, we face that rigidity that I was talking about that really opens us up for not really being adaptive and not really looking at the individual needs of all learners. And if you don't have a system in place for ensuring your content is accessible as it's being designed, because speaking from experience, I understand that if you're new to an organization or you're new in this space, it may feel very overwhelming to think like, oh my gosh, I have to put a whole process together and implement and this and this and this. Any strides you're making towards ensuring your content is accessible and therefore inclusive is a start. So start with like an accessibility audit, right? So that you can understand where you stand and where your organization stands in terms of accessibility. So again, I'll ask, how are you cultivating learning environments that are adaptable to individual learner needs? Hopefully we are all, providing closed captioning and things like that, but take a minute to think about, and please share in the chat, ways that you are offering flexible learning or different ways of engaging. Yeah, and Michelle, and speaking of creating psychologically safe spaces, thinking about something as simple as a name of the name of your session, right? Office hours. When you see something called an office hour, Michelle says, because I am not an authority figure imparting my knowledge, I went with workshop or lunch and learn because it feels more sort of user friendly. Jaleesa says implementing self-paced learning experience to give learners control and flexibility with their time, right? We know that there are some people, myself included, that when you put a time on something, that's all I'm thinking about when I'm in that learning experience is whether or not I'm going to finish this in time. I'm not really even retaining anything that I'm taking in. So making sure that your learning is and your learning environments and your materials are responsive to that. And finally, engagement. So how do we drive engagement through empathy in our learning environments? If you're familiar with constructivism, right? Constructivism emphasizes the importance of social interaction. But not only social interaction, cultural context in learning, right? Are these learning materials, is this environment culturally and contextually relevant to me, right? Learners should be actively involved in their learning processes and encouraged to share and discuss their experiences. But they're only going to feel safe in doing so if the environment and the materials and the content is culturally and contextually relevant to everyone. In inclusive learning environments, learners should feel empowered to contribute their own knowledge and perspectives, which is a key driver for engagement. But we need that cultural relevance to be acknowledged in order to earn that. So We know cultural and contextual relevance in learning is um, imperative. So when learners see themselves represented in learning materials, in environments, engagement and retention increases significantly, right? I think about, you know, in my own experience, right? You think about, say, you have a sales training webinar, right? And, because I'm with an insurance company, say it's an insurance sales training. How do you think, what kinds of biases are we projecting when we have every sales scenario that has a married couple are homeowners, and every sales scenario that has a single person is a renter, right? Design case studies and scenarios and learner personas and stories that are reflective of diverse backgrounds and perspectives, and train any learner facing folks like facilitators to acknowledge and leverage these perspectives rather than relying on um, what appear to be dominant cultural narratives, right? Like I go back to this example of the sales training scenario where every scenario where the prospects or the customers are homeowners, there's a married couple. In every scenario where they're renters, so they're a single person. Well, that just perpetuates this idea that only married people can own homes and only single people rent homes, which we know is not true. It's not reflective of reality. In research in cognitive psychology shows that unconscious bias influences decision making and can perpetuate stereotypes in learning materials. We also understand that the important role that prior knowledge plays in shaping learning. So, say we have someone come into our learning space that has prior knowledge that may be rooted in a bias. If our learning materials in our environments reinforce those stereotypes when we have a great opportunity to dismantle them, um, we're missing the point there. So to avoid reinforcing these biases, we need to conduct, just as we would conduct accessibility audits, conduct bias audits on your course content. It's easier than ever, right? We have all these AI tools that we can leverage to evaluate the diversity of the language used in our materials, the imagery used in our materials, the examples, the scenarios that we put forward. So I ask you all again to share in the chat, what are some ways that you are cultivating a learning environment that's culturally and contextually relevant? What are there other ways that you can share with the group? I like what Michelle, had shared, that to add a list up front of accommodations that are already available, then ask learners to share anything else that might help them to be more successful. I love that, right? That's learner centered. That's responding to the needs of each individual learner, and it's really giving that space for attendees or learners to provide what they want or what they need out of their learning experience. Are there any tools that you all may be using that can evaluate or that you can use to conduct biases in your learning content? Donna says creating stories, but with two path options. So you can either follow the story or get just the facts. I think that's great too. Some people need things to be presented, and it's funny because in my role where I am today, my team, we have like a wide variety of sales representatives that our team supports. And so even in that, sometimes, when you're designing education for one audience, they need that story, right? And that perspective. But another, audience type may need just the facts, right? So I think that's great too. So another thing that I want to discuss are barriers, right? So a lot of us may already be doing this within our organizations. We may be already following these strategies. We may already understand the importance of just leading with empathy at that foundational level to ensure that our learning environments are inclusive because we know the benefits. The business may not always know the benefits, right? So you might encounter resistance to implementing these inclusive practices. And it's not based on belief, usually. It's not that a business doesn't think it's the right thing to do. It's that they may not see the benefit from a business perspective, or as I like to call it, a business imperative. They may not see the business imperative that inclusive learning is. And so it's our job to frame these efforts as crucial drivers of innovation and engagement rather than a point of compliance, or as I like to say, a moral imperative. Like we just should ensure that our learning environments are accessible and are inclusive, but how do we translate that in a way that tells a story that we know the business will latch on to, right? Inclusive learning environments, we know, lead to higher employee engagement. We know lead to higher retention and performance. But we have to draw the direct link between that to the business outcomes so that we can tell the story that the business wants to hear, so that we can tell these types of stories that you see on the slide right now. Organizations with inclusive learning cultures are 1.7 times more likely to be innovation leaders in their industries. 74% of employees feel more valued and engaged when their workplace is inclusive. And we know the huge role L&D programs play in that. That inclusive learning environments report 30% higher employee retention rates. Those are the types of stories that they want to hear. So now we're going to talk about how do we use the data from our own learning programs in our own inclusive learning initiatives to tell these stories. Right? So we'll start with data that's easily accessible to you. So when I say that the business doesn't want to hear L&D data, that doesn't mean that we don't use it as a launch pad. But they don't want to hear, oh, we had X amount of completions, right? That's not a business. That's not directly tied to a business outcome unless we tell the story that it is, right? Start with that data, though. Start with learner satisfaction, participation rates, post-training application to get a sense of engagement and retention within your own programs, right? How engaged are learners in your programming? And is there data that supports a correlation between engagement in your programming and overall employee retention? Then go deeper. How are those that are engaged in learning in your learning programs performing compared to those who don't? Who is taking charge of their learning and enrolling in any maybe optional webinars you guys have out there? Is it the top performers? That tells a story. Depending on your structure, I understand it might be hard to get access to performance data. And so in those cases, we really can lean on qualitative data as well, right? Conduct focus groups, conduct surveys. You can assess how comfortable employees feel engaging in innovative behaviors or sharing new ideas by simply asking them, right? Say the business launches a new sales process that they want all sales representatives to follow because they know it'll lead to some key sales KPIs, close rates, retention, customer satisfaction. But you find through surveys or focus groups that employees don't feel comfortable trying new things or engaging in innovative behaviors. So you're probably not going to get those KPIs that the business knows that they're going to get from this process, because you're not going to get the engagement in the process, because there's not a space. There's not the space that they feel like they can be innovative and they can try new things. So based on what you find, determine what you can do from a learning perspective to either enable this or to cultivate this, and share those learner insights with the business so that you can demonstrate the impact that inclusive learning has on the overall business. Create a clear connection between inclusive learning initiatives and key business KPIs, whether it be productivity, sales, satisfaction. So I'll give an example of, what this looks like in practice. Say you have and I keep saying sales training because that's where I am in my career right now, but say you have a sales training program, right, that aims to educate sales producers on how to tailor their sales approach to different cultural communication styles, and to understand and respect diverse customer preferences, right? That is going to be tied to these key indicators, right? Close rate, customer retention, and team collaboration, which is what the business wants to move the needle on. So sales representatives who understand and respect diverse customer preferences, well, they'll build trust and rapport more authentically. And if that trust and rapport is built more authentically, then you're more likely to close, right? That's the goal here, thus increasing that close rate. If customers feel valued when sales representatives acknowledge and adapt to their unique needs without sounding like they're reading from a script, then that will lead to stronger long-term relationships, brand loyalty, which will improve customer retention. And then providing a diverse and inclusive sales training environment where you bring everybody in to share their different perspectives and their sales techniques, that fosters innovation and problem solving and strategy development amongst peers. So in this example, you would look to the business to sort of provide those key goals that they're after, right? The increase in close rate, retention, and maybe overall team collaboration. And you look at performance before and after, right? Those key KPIs, conversion rates, customer satisfaction, and retention. And you show the increase based on this initiative that's really rooted in leading with empathy and creating this inclusive learning environment. And that's just one example. There are tons of examples out in the industry, and I'm sure even across this conference and probably in this room right now. Look at in 2021, right? Salesforce, they launched their Leadership Excellence Initiative, which focused on enhancing emotional intelligence and empathy that resulted in a 30% increase in employee engagement and a 25% increase in employee retention. That's the kind of story that you want to be able to tell the business from your learning programs. Microsoft, their growth mindset initiative, where they emphasize a growth mindset combined with empathetic leadership, which led to a 45% increase in employee confidence and a 20% increase in learner application rates. So as a result of this initiative, learners were actually more engaged in the learning programs as well. Google, their Search Inside Yourself initiative, which was focused on mindfulness and emotional intelligence, led to a 50% improvement in team productivity So real business results and a 35% increase in leadership effectiveness. Can anybody, are there any notable examples that anybody can share in the chat that they think about when we're having this discussion? Or maybe your organization, or maybe your company has an empathy driven L&D initiative that you've gotten good results or great business results from. I'll give you guys a minute to share in the chat or to think about it. So what we learned today is how empathy bridges the gap between theory, so those basic foundational educational theory, and practice. So how we implement and how we implement the key principles of those theories into our practice, into our design practice, into our educational programming to create these inclusive learning cultures. So if we lead with constructivism, with pragmatism, with humanism, which are innately rooted in empathy, we can create and cultivate learning environments that foster psychological safety, representation, accessibility. We can proactively address barriers, bias, accessibility gaps, resistance from the business, right? So that we can foster greater engagement, innovation, and performance, not only in our programs, but across the organizations. But this requires systemic change and leaders in the field that prioritize empathy as a core principle of learning and development. So I asked this group, who better than the women of L&D, to lead the charge? And that's all I have for you guys today.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. That was so packed with my favorite thing was you had so many actionable steps that we could take with your key takeaways and your key points and key strategies, really. Um, and I was like, as we were going through the PowerPoint, what I pointed out earlier was I love that you said that empathy was a skill, because I feel like empathy is often seen as like an emotional trait or like a trait that only certain people have and other people can't really practice and build upon it. But when you use empathy as a skill and, as you said, as a business strategy, that gives us the framework to sort of build it up and to practice it and to make more empathetic and inclusive choices, which, your whole presentation told us, hey, this gives us results. This gives us uh, quantifiable and, as Jeanette said, qualitative data that we can take back to our managers and back to our organizations and companies and say, this is why we need this.
Yeah.
And, this picture is great. I'm strong. I'm invincible. I'm a woman. I think that women are more often than not seen as the carriers of empathy, and it's sort of like we hold the key to creating those cultures in the workplace. So I would just kind of like to discuss that a little bit further on almost like why we are such why we are seen as the powerhouses of empathy and creating those cultures in our work environments. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I like how you call it the powerhouses of empathy, because I feel like a lot of times it's seen as like a negative trait, right?
Absolutely.
Like this, person is too empathetic, right? Versus like it being a true skill that drives true business results. So I think shifting the language around how we talk about empathy, and this is a start, right? When we ensure that the business around us understands that not only is leveraging empathy in our practice crucial for positive business transformation, but everybody should be trained in empathy as a skill, and it should be
Absolutely.
seen as a skill versus maybe like a trait, because then that's where we get into where we can start thinking about it in terms of like being something that could hold you back, but reframing empathy as it truly is a superpower, as we talked about, and really is the key, and not only L&D but in other areas of the business too. So I think it really starts with just shifting the narrative around um, how empathy is seen
Mhm.
as both a trait and a skill.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And I think, it goes so much deeper than that because as you approach more intersectionalities of like your community and how you identify and move through our society, you sort of get further away from empathy, the further away you get from that identification, whether you are like you're a woman, you're trans, or you have different background as a minority or as a person of color, like the further you get away from that woman identification, I think the further away you get from empathy being something that you bring to your professional like environment. And that's not me saying that, someone who's a man and who is like a man of color is incapable of bringing empathy to their professional background, but I feel like it's just something that's not as celebrated and also not as, like that environment isn't there for them. That support isn't there for them. And I think building empathy into your training materials and all of that. And like you were saying, using more diverse backgrounds whenever you're uh, creating training materials, that sort of opens that door and allows that people to bring more of their experience into it, and that helps us foster a more empathetic work culture.
yeah, and I think too, calling it out when it is like sort of an empathy driven decision or initiative, because I think I gave the example about we may look at I always give like that sales training example because that's just like where I'm at all the time, of when we make a decision to say something like, okay, let's stop making um, all homeowners married couples,
Yeah.
right? That can be seen as creating an inclusive learning culture that's rooted in empathy, right? Because
Hmm.
we don't want to perpetuate this bias that single people can't own homes, right? But also understanding that that has real business impact too. That
Yeah.
may change the way that a sales representative talks to people that, they call in and they gather information about them and they find out that they're not married. Maybe they're in practice not pushing a homeowner's product because they just have this bias that this person's not married. They probably don't have a house, so I'm not going to like bundle or whatever behavior that's coming from those biases. That's a true that has like true business implications. So
Absolutely.
being able to not say like, oh, this is a we're doing this for the business, but saying we're doing this because this is creating an inclusive education environment that is linked to a better business outcome, and not shying away from that creation of that inclusive education environment being the driver for that business outcome.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that step gets skipped a lot because maybe we feel like, well, the business doesn't care that I like made this more inclusive. I mean, depending on where you work, I can say, my company cares, but I've also experienced a bit in environments where they didn't, where
Yeah.
clients didn't really care. They're like, just do what you got to do to like get the result. And I think we need to lean into to that and not shy away from the fact that like it's a decision that's made out of an empathy driven practice in L&D that has a real business implication.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I'm very curious then. When you said that you worked for a company that was just like, oh, we don't really care if you make it inclusive, did that affect, your psychological approach to creating materials for them? Because that's something you talked about heavily in your presentation.
Yeah, I think for me, it didn't affect my psychological approach. Like, when you feel like this is the right thing to do and you're sort of like staunch in your processes that you follow, I will say it makes it harder, right? Because we know that sometimes doing that creates a little more thought and a little more time that you put in, where the business or the client may say, I want it done in X and I don't really
Mhm.
care how long. So that's where it becomes so important to have those conversations around, well, you know, I'm going to need to leverage this tool, or I'm going to need to engage these resources to ensure that we're creating. Or maybe it's like a webinar or something where you need multiple facilitators, and they don't want to pay for two facilitators. Trying to have that conversation to say that this isn't really just like a design decision or an L&D decision. Like, I having those conversations to explain how that is going to result in a real business impact, I think,
Yeah,
is the challenge, because a lot of times um, you just have to position it effectively to where they
yeah.
understand the return on that investment that they're going to get from ensuring that it's an inclusive initiative.
Yeah, you have to like whenever you're framing it in a business mindset, you always have to be able to
Mm,
have that quantifiable data and let the business know, well, investing in this is worth it
yeah.
because here are the statistics right here. And, I think, again, going back to your presentation, you did such a great job with that. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's been right on par with the rest of the sessions that we've seen from this conference on women in learning and development. And, I think talking about empathy and like we were discussing earlier, how women are sort of like these powerhouses of empathy because of the many hats that we wear in our society and in our personal lives. This was such an important and needed discussion to have. So I truly appreciate your time and I appreciate the work that you put into this presentation because it was phenomenal. If you came in at the end of our session, this will be recorded and on the TLDC website. So please feel free to check that out or any of the other sessions that we may have missed. I thank you all so much for your time here. And Sarah, if you have any last things that you'd like to add.
No, I would just say this community is amazing. The talks that have happened so far and that are up are amazing. And as Jaleesa was saying, it's sort of amazing how all the topics are sort of intertwined in some way. Like, literally, there was a session on psychological safety right prior to this. And so I would just say, look to the network that TLDC provides, and look to the resources that everybody's sort of providing to continue on your journeys to creating more equitable and inclusive learning environments within your spaces.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I did just drop your LinkedIn in the chat, so everyone please feel free to connect with Sarah. And thank you all so much for coming. That's going to conclude our session, and we will see you again. I think tomorrow's the next one. I can't remember from the top of my head, but
Thank,
please take care, everyone. Thank you, Sarah.
thank you. Bye.
Bye.